November 24, 1944. Easley Field, Saipan, Mariana Islands. Lieutenant Colonel Robert K. Morgan advanced the throttles of his B-29 Superfortress Dauntless Doi, leading 110 aircraft of the 73rd Bomb Wing toward Tokyo. The instruments before him told a story the Japanese High Command refused to believe. The turbo-supercharger boost gauges climbed steadily, maintaining sea-level power at altitudes where enemy fighters gasped for oxygen. Today, these silver giants would demonstrate a technological advantage Japan could not counter. Hidden within each engine, NL sat twin General Electric turbo-superchargers, devices that would prove more decisive than any gun or bomb. These mechanisms, utilizing exhaust gases to compress intake air, allowed the massive Wright R3350 engines to maintain 2,200 horsepower at altitudes approaching 32,000 ryus. Japanese fighters designed for agility at medium altitudes struggled to reach these heights. Their engines, lacking effective high-altitude supercharging, lost power dramatically in thin air. This was the first B-29 raid on Tokyo. From the newly captured Marina bases, only 1,500 man-orders from Japan's capital. Unlike earlier missions from distant China, these bombers could strike regularly and return safely. The pressurized cabins meant crews breathed normally, while Japanese interceptors struggled with crude oxygen systems that often failed at extreme altitude. As Morgan's bomber lifted into the morning sky, followed by over 100 others, the technological gap between American and Japanese aviation became undeniable. 5 months earlier, on June 15, 1944, the first B-29 strategic bombing mission against Japan had launched from Chengdu, China. 75 superfortresses took off that evening, though only 47 reached the primary target at Yawata on Kyushu. The mission demonstrated both the B-29's potential and the challenges ahead. 7 aircraft were lost, 1 shot down over target, 1 destroyed on the ground after emergency landing, and 5 in operational accidents. 57 airmen died. Yet even this costly introduction revealed Japanese defenses were inadequate against high-altitude bombers. Japanese radar operators on Kyushu detected the approaching formations. Air raid sirens wailed across Yawata. Pilots of the Imperial Army's 4th Sententi scrambled to their Kawasaki Ki-45 Toyu twin-engine fighters, climbing aggressively toward the bombers flying at altitudes between 8,000 and 21,000 ft. Even at these relatively modest heights dictated by fuel constraints on the long mission from China, Japanese interceptors struggled. Their Nakajima Har-25 engines, rated at 1,080 horsepower each, lacked effective turbo-supercharging. Above 20,000 ft, these engines produced perhaps 60% of rated power. Warrant Officer Sadamitsu Kimura managed to close on one B-29, the aircraft designated Limber Dragon, with 12 crew aboard. His attack succeeded, sending the Superfortress down in flames with no survivors. But this lone victory came at terrible cost. Kimura expended nearly all his ammunition and barely returned to base, with his engine overheating dangerously at altitude. Around him, other Japanese pilots fired desperately at silver bombers, but most attacks failed to inflict damage. The B-29's defensive armament, controlled by advanced fire control systems, responded with devastating accuracy. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi of the Imperial Army's 244th Senti, one of Japan's most skilled fighter leaders, later documented the frustration in his unit's reports. American bombers operated at altitudes where Japanese fighters barely maintained level flight, let alone maneuvered for combat. The B-29's speed, at altitude, approximately 350 meters each, matched what Japanese interceptors could achieve in thin air above 25,000 ft. Even reaching bombing altitude cost fighters excessive fuel, leaving reduced ammunition capacity and engines running so hot that catastrophic failure threatened constantly. The secret to American superiority lay in technology Japan had explored but never successfully implemented. General, Electric's turbo-supercharger type B series for the Wright R3350E engine represented masterful engineering. Each B-29 engine mounted two devices that used hot exhaust gases to spin turbine wheels exceeding 20,000 revolutions per minute. These turbines drove centrifugal compressors, forcing air into engine intake manifolds at pressures equivalent to sea level, even at 30,000 ft altitude. The principle was elegant. Waste exhaust energy normally lost to atmosphere, instead performed useful work by compressing intake air. This allowed engines to burn fuel efficiently at altitudes where unassisted engines suffocated. Each turbocharger added approximately 115 kilojoules per engine installation, but delivered performance equivalent to doubling engine displacement. Without turbochargers, the B-29 would have been merely another heavy bomber, vulnerable to interception and unable to utilize altitude as defensive advantage. Japan experimented with turbo-supercharging as early as 1941, when Nakajima Aircraft Company engineers examined captured technical documents and obtained sample units through circuitous routes before America entered the war. Japanese engineers recognized the military advantage such technology provided. Yet, despite 3 years of development, Japan never produced operational turbo-supercharged fighters in meaningful numbers. The reasons reveal the industrial chasm between Japan and America. Turbo-superchargers demanded metallurgy beyond Japanese capabilities. Turbine wheels operated in exhaust temperatures exceeding 1 to 1500 degrees F while spinning at velocities creating centrifugal stresses equivalent to thousands of pounds per square inch. Any metal imperfection caused catastrophic turbine failure. American manufacturers like General Electric possessed metallurgical expertise, precision forging equipment, and quality control systems to produce reliable turbines. Japanese industry, stretched thin by war demands, could not match these standards. Lieutenant Fumio Nia were an engineering officer who evaluated captured B-29 components later in the war, documented findings that survived in Japanese archives. Examining a turbocharger removed from a crashed B-29 in China, NIA marveled at American manufacturing precision. Turbine blades were machined to tolerances measured in thousandth of an inch, balanced so perfectly that units spun at maximum speed without vibration. High-temperature alloys used in turbine construction exceeded anything Japanese industry produced. Even bearings designed to operate in extreme heat while maintaining precise alignment represented manufacturing capabilities Japan did not possess. More devastating was the systematic nature of American turbocharger production. General Electric's Schenectady, New York plant manufactured thousands monthly, each meeting exacting specifications. Production lines incorporated automated testing equipment, verifying performance of every unit before installation. Defective components were identified and rejected before reaching operational aircraft. Japanese attempts at turbocharger production yielded perhaps dozens monthly. With reliability so poor, most failed after few operational hours. By August 1944, Japanese intelligence compiled disturbing reports about American bomber capabilities. Interrogation of captured B-29 crewmen, wreckage analysis, and pilot observations painted a picture of technological superiority that shocked military leaders. The B-29 was not simply a large bomber. It was a flying weapons system incorporating innovations Japan could not match. Colonel Takushiro Hattori, an operations officer at Imperial General Headquarters, wrote in his diary that month about implications of B-29 raids. American bombers operated with impunity at altitudes Japanese fighters could not effectively reach. The few interceptors managing engagement reported that even when scoring hits, the B-29's rugged construction absorbed damage that would destroy Japanese aircraft. Most alarming was realization that these raids represented only the beginning. American production capabilities suggested thousands of B-29s would eventually attack Japan, each one beyond effective defensive reach. The Mathematics of interception had turned catastrophically against Japan. A fighter climbing from ground level to 30,000 AUD-FT consumed perhaps 30 minutes and burned 1/3 of its fuel load. At altitude, fighter performance degraded dramatically. Guns, while deadly at close range, required pilots to close. Within a few hundred ft of targets, a maneuver made nearly impossible by reduced aircraft performance and B-29 defensive fire control systems. Even successful interceptions often cost irreplaceable experienced pilots who died when damaged or fuel-depleted fighters crashed attempting to return from extreme altitude. Major Makoto Ogawa, who eventually claimed 7 B-29 kills to become one of Japan's most successful Superfortress hunters, later described the overwhelming disadvantage Japanese pilots faced. American bombers flew in a realm where Japanese aircraft barely functioned. Americans enjoyed pressurized cabins with heated compartments, while Japanese pilots endured temperatures 40 degrees below zero at high altitude, their fingers numb, despite electrically heated flight suits that rarely worked properly. Oxygen systems frequently malfunctioned, leaving pilots hypoxic and disoriented. Gun barrels froze, ammunition belts jammed in cold, and engines ran so rough that pilots constantly feared flameouts. Japanese aircraft designers desperately sought solutions. The Nakajima Ki-87, developed specifically as a high-altitude B-29 interceptor, incorporated a turbo-supercharged Nakajima HAR-219 engine intended to deliver effective performance above 30,000 AUD-FT. On paper, the design was impressive. Service ceiling above 40,000 AUD-FT, heavy armament of 30mm and 20mm cannon, and speed sufficient to overtake B-29 formations. Only one prototype flew before war's end, in April 1945, demonstrating severe problems. The turbocharger, cobbled together from inadequate materials with insufficient testing, failed repeatedly. Even when functioning, it delivered inconsistent performance. The project died not from lack of engineering skill, but from lack of industrial capacity to produce reliable turbochargers. The Tachikawa Ki-94, another proposed high-altitude interceptor, never progressed beyond mock-up stage. The Mitsubishi J-8M, a rocket-powered interceptor based on the German Mi-163 Comet, offered high-altitude capability, without turbochargers, but dangerous rocket fuel and extremely short endurance made it impractical for defending against B-29 raids. Japan's finest aeronautical engineers understood what was needed, but lacked the industrial foundation to produce it. American B-29 operations expanded relentlessly. By November 1944, 21st Bomber Command began flying missions from Marana bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands lay only 1,500 km from Tokyo, well within B-29 range. Robert K. Morgan's mission on November 24th sent 111 Superfortresses against the Musashino Aircraft Engine Plant in Tokyo. Weather and jet stream winds limited results, but the psychological impact on Japan was profound. American bombers now struck the homeland almost daily, and Japanese defenses proved increasingly ineffective. Sergeant Shoi Suzuki, an anti-aircraft gunner stationed near Tokyo, kept a diary documenting growing despair among defenders. Initially, his unit engaged B-29 formations with confidence, their 75mm guns firing shells to altitudes around 25,000 TRS-FT. But American bombers often flew higher, beyond gun range, or approached at angles, giving gunners insufficient tracking time. More frustrating, even direct hits rarely brought down B-29s. The bombers' structure built with redundant systems and armored in critical areas withstood damage that would have shredded Japanese aircraft. Suzuki recorded watching crippled B-29s trailing smoke with engines shut down, continuing toward targets and often returning safely to base. Japanese efforts to improve air defenses focused on fighter performance modifications. The Kawasaki K-61 High-End, powered by a liquid-cooled HAR-40 engine, could reach altitudes around 32,000 ft higher than most Japanese fighters, but climb rate was insufficient and engine reliability so poor that many Kai-61s were grounded awaiting spare parts. The Nakajima 84 Hayate, introduced in 1944, represented Japan's best mass-produced fighter. It featured the Nakajima Homara engine, a complex radial design delivering good performance at altitude when properly maintained. However, the Homar's intricate construction made it maintenance intensive, and quality control problems meant many engines failed prematurely. The Kai-84's theoretical performance was impressive. Maximum speed around 400 m at 20,000 CFU, service ceiling near 35,000 CFT, and heavy armament of 20 mm and 30 mm cannon. In practice, few Ki-84s achieved these specifications. Poor quality fuel damaged engines, crude lubricants broke down at low temperatures, and manufacturing defects caused frequent failures. American pilots who flew captured Ki-84s after the war praised handling and performance, noting it matched or exceeded American fighters in some respects. But they also observed that these captured examples had been selected for exceptional condition maintained by skilled Japanese mechanics using hoarded, high-quality materials. The average operational Ki-84 performed far below design specifications. Even when Japanese fighters reached B-29 operating altitudes, they faced the bomber's sophisticated defensive armament. Each Superfortress mounted 1,050 caliber machine guns in remote-controlled turrets. A central fire control system allowed gunners to coordinate fire, concentrating multiple turrets on single targets. The system incorporated computing sites automatically calculating lead and deflection, significantly improving hit probability. Japanese pilots quickly learned that approaching within effective gun range of a B-29 formation meant flying through coordinated barrages few survived. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was devastating. They had been trained to believe in Japanese aviation superiority in invincibility of Bushido spirit over material advantage. Reality of combat against B-29s shattered these illusions. Captain Yasuhiko Kuroai, a veteran fighter pilot with the 302nd Air Group, wrote in a letter discovered after the war that fighting B-29s felt like attacking a fortress. Bombers absorbed punishment that would destroy a dozen Japanese aircraft, their crews protected by armor and redundant systems, while Japanese pilots flew unarmored fighters with vulnerable fuel tanks and minimal protection. December 1944 brought the first major daylight raid against Tokyo when 86 B-29s attacked the Musashino plant. Japanese defenses managed to shoot down or damage several bombers, but at terrible cost. The 244th Sentai, led by Captain Kobayashi, claimed 6 B-29s destroyed through desperate ramming attacks, but lost multiple irreplaceable pilots in the process. Ramming became increasingly common as Japanese pilots realized conventional attacks often failed to bring down massive bombers. The tactic was suicidal. Pilots aimed fighters at B-29 wing roots or tail assemblies, hoping to destroy control surfaces, then attempted to bail out before impact. Few survived. American crews respected the fanatical courage of Japanese pilots even as they were horrified by waste of lives. Technical Sergeant John McLaughlin, a gunner on City of Los Angeles, later recounted watching a Japanese fighter deliberately ram the B-29 flying beside his. The fighter struck the bomber's tail, shearing off the entire vertical stabilizer. Both aircraft fell from formation in uncontrolled spins. McLaughlin saw no parachutes. He later learned the B-29 crew, 10 men, died in the crash. The Japanese pilot's name was never known, one of thousands who died defending their homeland against an enemy they could not defeat. By early 1945, Japanese air defenses had deteriorated near collapse. Fuel shortages grounded many fighters. Experienced pilots had been killed in staggering numbers, replaced by teenagers with minimal training who stood no chance against veteran B-29 crews. American fighter, escorts P-51 Mustangs flying from Iwo after its capture in March 1945 made defending against B-29 raids even more hopeless. Japanese interceptors climbing slowly to altitude became easy targets for P-51s that could outclimb, outrun, and outfight any Japanese fighter. The night of March 9th to 10th, 1945 marked the worst disaster in Japanese history. General Curtis LeMay, commanding 21st Bomber Command, ordered a radical change in tactics. Instead of precision bombing from high altitude, 334 B-29s would attack Tokyo at night from altitudes around 7,000 ft, carrying incendiary bombs designed to start fires. The decision was controversial. Lower altitude exposed bombers to heavier anti-aircraft fire. But LeMay calculated correctly that Japanese night defenses were weak and lower altitude eliminated turbocharger stress, engine overheating issues, and allowed each B-29 to carry vastly more bombs. Results exceeded LeMay's expectations. In 3 hours, American bombers dropped nearly 2,000 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo's crowded districts. Firestorms developed, creating winds that sucked oxygen from shelters and generated temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees. EF. An estimated 100,000 people died, more than either atomic bombing would later kill. 16 square miles of the city burned to ash. Only 14 B-29s were lost, remarkably low given the raid's intensity. The Tokyo firebombing demonstrated that, even without exploiting high-altitude capability, B-29s could devastate Japan. But turbo-superchargers had made the B-29 force possible. Without ability to operate at altitude, to fly above weather, to cruise beyond fighter reach, the strategic bombing campaign would have been unsustainable. Missions from China across vast distances to Kyushu required high-altitude efficiency. Daylight precision raids on aircraft factories and oil refineries demanded the protection altitude provided. Even low-level firebombing raids were possible only because American air superiority had been established through earlier high-altitude operations that destroyed Japanese fighter production. Japanese engineers who examined captured B-29 components after the war expressed bitter admiration for American engineering. Turbochargers represented everything Japan's industry lacked: precision manufacturing, advanced materials, rigorous quality control, and capacity to produce thousands of complex units monthly. A single B-29 contained 8 turbochargers. American production exceeded 200 B-29s monthly by 1945, meaning 1,600 turbochargers monthly just for new aircraft, plus thousands more for replacements and maintenance. General Electric's factories produced these at rates Japan could not have achieved if devoting its entire aircraft engine industry solely to turbocharger production. The broader implications were clear to thoughtful Japanese observers. If America could produce turbochargers in such quantities, what else could it produce? The answer was evident in waves of B-29s appearing over Japan almost daily by summer 1945. P-51's escorts that destroyed Japanese fighters with ease, in naval forces that blockaded Japan completely, in atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. First Lieutenant Toshio Ott, a technical intelligence officer who survived the war, later wrote that examining captured American aviation technology induced despair among Japanese engineers. Every system, every component demonstrated manufacturing quality and engineering sophistication beyond Japanese capabilities. Turbochargers particularly impressed him because their operation was conceptually simple. Yet execution required precision that Japan's war-damaged industry could no longer achieve. Even had Japan somehow obtained turbocharger designs in EU 1941. He concluded it lacked the industrial base to produce them in useful quantities. The human cost of this technological gap was staggering. Japanese pilot training programs, once rigorous and producing superb aviators, had collapsed by 1945. Fuel shortages meant student pilots received perhaps 50 hours of flight training compared to 200 to 300 hours American pilots received. These inadequately trained pilots flew obsolescent aircraft against opponents who enjoyed every advantage. In July 1945, during a major battle over the inland sea, Japanese fighters attacked a formation of over 100 B-29s. American records show perhaps 2 bombers damaged, while Japanese forces lost 23 fighters destroyed with minimal damage inflicted on bombers. The B-29 campaign ultimately delivered 147,000 tons of bombs on Japanese targets, destroyed 40% of urban industrial areas in 66 cities, and killed an estimated 330,000 civilians. Japanese war production, already declining, collapsed completely by summer 1945. Transportation networks were destroyed, making it impossible to move resources even where they existed. Workers abandoned factories to flee burning cities. The government lost control of economic planning as industries dispersed into rural areas or ceased operation. Major General Aris Suer-Seizo, chief of Japanese military intelligence, admitted after the war that by June 1945, his analysts recognized defeat was inevitable. American air supremacy was absolute. The B-29 campaign had destroyed Japan's ability to wage war, yet the government, trapped by military honor codes forbidding surrender, continued fighting until atomic bombs provided justification for capitulation. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, marked the end of World War II. Those atomic bombs were delivered by B-29s, aircraft whose ability to reach targets in Japan and return safely depended fundamentally on turbo-supercharger technology. The Enola Gay, flying at 31,000 ft over Hiroshima, operated at altitude made possible by 8 General Electric turbochargers maintaining engine power in thin air. Even at war's end, with Japanese defenses essentially non-existent, altitude capability provided by turbochargers offered protection against remaining anti-aircraft fire and allowed crews to escape atomic blast effects. Post-war interviews with Japanese fighter pilots revealed a consistent theme: admiration mixed with frustration. They respected American engineering and recognized that no amount of pilot skill could overcome technological disadvantage. Lieutenant Isamu Sasaki, who survived the war with 3 B-29 kills, one of the highest tallies achieved, later reflected that his successes came only when circumstances were perfect. Surprise attack from above with sun behind him against isolated bombers separated from formations. Against formations flying at altitude with alert crews, even the best Japanese pilots rarely succeeded. The development of high-altitude aviation capability had been pursued by many nations before World War II. Germany developed turbo-superchargers but never successfully deployed them operationally, focusing instead on mechanical superchargers, which were simpler but less efficient at extreme altitude. Britain relied primarily on sophisticated multi-stage mechanical superchargers providing good, high-altitude performance without turbocharging complexity. America alone made turbo-supercharging standard equipment on heavy bombers, accepting additional complexity, cost, and maintenance burden in return for unprecedented high-altitude capability. This decision reflected American industrial confidence. Turbo-superchargers required precision manufacturing, regular maintenance by skilled mechanics, and steady supply of spare parts. America possessed the infrastructure to support these requirements. Japan did not. Even if Japanese engineers had designed perfect turbochargers in 1941, the nation lacked manufacturing base to produce them in quantity, maintenance organization to keep them functioning, and a supply system to provide necessary spare parts and replacement units. The post-war U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that the B-29 campaign was decisively effective in destroying Japan's capacity to wage war. While survey authors debated whether Japan would have surrendered without atomic bombs or planned invasion, They unanimously agreed that by August 1945, American air supremacy was complete and Japanese defenses were shattered. The B-29's technological advantages, particularly high-altitude capability enabled by turbo-superchargers, made this outcome inevitable once sufficient bombers became available. Japanese records captured after the war revealed the extent to which B-29 raids dominated military planning from late 1944 onward. Imperial General Headquarters devoted enormous resources to air defense, pulling fighter units from other theaters, constructing thousands of anti-aircraft positions, and training tens of thousands of troops for airfield defense. All efforts proved futile. Against formations flying at altitude with alert crews, even the best Japanese pilots rarely succeeded. The development of high-altitude aviation capability had been pursued by many nations before World War II. Germany developed turbo-superchargers but never successfully deployed them operationally, focusing instead on mechanical superchargers, which were simpler but less efficient at extreme altitude. Britain relied primarily on sophisticated multi-stage mechanical superchargers providing good high-altitude performance without turbocharging complexity. America alone made turbo-supercharging standard equipment on heavy bombers, accepting additional complexity, cost, and maintenance burden in return for unprecedented high-altitude capability. This decision reflected American industrial confidence. Turbo-superchargers required precision manufacturing, regular maintenance by skilled mechanics, and steady supply of spare parts. America possessed the infrastructure to support these requirements. Japan did not. Even if Japanese engineers had designed perfect turbochargers in 1941, the nation lacked manufacturing base to produce them in quantity, maintenance organization to keep them functioning, and a supply system to provide necessary spare parts and replacement units. The post-war U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that the B-29 campaign was decisively effective in destroying Japan's capacity to wage war. While survey authors debated whether Japan would have surrendered without atomic bombs or planned invasion, they unanimously agreed that by August 1945, American air supremacy was complete and Japanese defenses were shattered. The B-29's technological advantages, particularly high-altitude capability enabled by turbo-superchargers, made this outcome inevitable once sufficient bombers became available. Japanese records captured after the war revealed the extent to which B-29 raids dominated military planning from late 1944 onward. Imperial General Headquarters devoted enormous resources to air defense, pulling fighter units from other theaters, constructing thousands of anti-aircraft positions and training tens of thousands of troops for airfield defense. All efforts proved futile, against bombers operating beyond effective defensive reach. The final B-29 mission against Japan flew on August 14, 1945, the day before surrender was announced. More than 300 superfortresses attacked targets near Tokyo, encountering no opposition. Japanese fighters remained on the ground, conserving fuel for the expected American invasion that would never come. B-29 crews returned to their Marana bases, not yet knowing the war was effectively over. Their missions completed through cumulative destruction of hundreds of raids Japan could not prevent or effectively counter. In decades following the war, aviation historians and aeronautical engineers conducted extensive analyses of B-29 technological advantages. The consensus was clear. Turbo-supercharging provided fundamental capability that made strategic bombing of Japan possible from remote bases. Without this technology, B-29s would have been limited to operations at altitudes around 20,000 ft, well within range of Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Losses would have been unsustainable. The entire strategic concept of bombing Japan from Mariana bases would have been impractical. The lessons Japanese engineers learned from examining American aviation technology influenced post-war Japanese industrial development. Emphasis on precision manufacturing, quality control, and systematic engineering that characterized American turbo-supercharger production became hallmarks of Japan's post-war economic miracle. Former aviation engineers moved into civilian industries, bringing hard-won understanding of advanced manufacturing techniques. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress flew its last combat mission in 1954 during the Korean War. By then, jet-powered bombers were replacing propeller-driven aircraft, and turbo-supercharging for piston engines had become obsolete. But the B-29's legacy endured. It demonstrated that technological superiority could overcome numerical inferiority, that industrial capacity was as important as individual courage, and that air power alone could destroy a nation's ability to wage war. Today, only 2 B-29s remain airworthy, preserved, and maintained by dedicated organizations, ensuring future generations can witness these historic aircraft. When these bombers fly at air shows, their right are 3350 engines producing that distinctive, deep-throated roar. Few spectators realize that hidden within engine cells are turbo-superchargers, survivors of technology that helped end history's most destructive war. Those components spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute as B-29s climbed toward altitude still perform the function they were designed for. 8 decades ago, compressing air to maintain engine power in thin atmosphere. The story of Japanese forces facing B-29 Superfortresses ultimately demonstrates how industrial capability and technological development determined modern warfare outcomes. The turbo-superchargers that allowed B-29s to operate at 30,000 ft, the industrial system producing thousands of these complex components, the training programs preparing crews to use them effectively, the supply system keeping them functioning. These were the true weapons of the strategic bombing campaign. The B-29's technological superiority did not make American victories certain from war's beginning. But once American industry mobilized, once B-29 production reached full scale, once Marana air bases became operational, defeat became inevitable for Japan. No amount of pilot skill, no level of sacrifice could overcome material and technological advantages embodied in those silver bombers that droned overhead at altitudes where Japanese fighters gasped for air. When B-29s cruised at 30,000 ft over Japan, their turbochargers spinning silently within engine-maintaining seal power in stratospheric air, they carried more than bombs. They carried proof that industrial might had become the decisive factor in modern warfare and that America possessed that might in quantities no enemy could match. Japan never expected this reality. And once the silver bombers filled the skies over the home islands, operating beyond defensive reach, there was nothing Japan could do to stop.